Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Navina, and on behalf of Capital Markets Malaysia, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our 2-hour webinar today, entitled A Sustainable Supply Chain, the Role of SMEs. This webinar will take about 2 hours, so we're starting at 10:30 and we'll end at 12:30. During which time we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So you will note that at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask during the course of the webinar, we'd like you to just click on this box and ask your question, and it will be addressed by the speakers. We will also be running a few polls throughout the 2 hours. And so we'd really hope that you will take the opportunity to participate in these polls. I'd like to now just go through some administrative details. We won't be taking any breaks during the session. At the end of the session, you'll see that there will be a pop-up of an evaluation form. We really hope that you would also fill this evaluation form out, and so we can improve our future events. We have 2 speakers lined up for you today, and I'd like to now just introduce them. We have Margie Ong, who is CEO of Thoughts in Gear, which is a sustainability consulting firm. Margie is an engineer with previous experience from the Boston Consulting Group, Intel, and HCL. We also have a guest speaker, Tobias Mangelman. Tobias is Managing Director of Lasaju Consulting, which is a Malaysian consulting firm focused on transforming systems for a better and more sustainable future. Prior to that, Tobias has spent most of his professional life with McKinsey & Co. and Poiri Management Consulting. So before I introduce our 2 speakers, I would like to welcome Zalina Shamsuddin, who is General Manager of Capital Markets Malaysia, to say a few words. Zalina, over to you.
Thanks, Navina. Hi, morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. As we mentioned before, CSC is primarily set up to help corporates improve their sustainability footprint, to help you with capacity development, and to help you in terms of developing knowledge, technical skills, and enabling you to engage with your stakeholders better. The reason why we're running this program, which is primarily directed at SMEs, and this will be the first of many more to come, was we looked at a report recently by Standard Chartered that was released in June of 2021, which is called Carbon Dated. And this was an important report, important and interesting and relevant for us in Malaysia, because it highlighted the fact that nearly 73% of MNCs globally are addressing the carbon footprint very seriously. And by 2025, they're going to start transitioning to a net zero position. And of that, of all those MNCs, the stats that came in showed that 67% of them say that most of their carbon footprint comes from their supply chain. And most of them are planning to address their supply chain, which is very much players like ourselves, who SMEs, and also MNCs that are based in Malaysia who supply to the global supply chain. One of the main things that we found worrying was, besides China and India, Malaysia is the 5th most exposed market in terms of our exports to this changing trend in the more mature markets, whereby when regulations become more strict about your carbon footprint. When the study also shows that one of the major limitations that supply chain emissions face is the fact is there's lack of knowledge and the lack of disclosures. It was based on those 2 facts that we worked with Margie and Tobias to come up with this program. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to teach SMEs, and we're also reaching out to you MNCs who have SMEs in your supply chain to understand how to recognize what their carbon footprint is, how to measure their carbon footprint, and then adequately disclose it so it helps them in improving their positioning in the global supply chain, and also does not jeopardize their ability to export. I hope you find this program as interesting as we hope it will be. Please do join us, and please do spread the word amongst all the others as well. This will be the first of many more to come. Thank you very much. Navina?
Thanks very much for that, Zalina. So, ladies and gentlemen, just before I introduce Margie, I'd just like to say that whatever slides are shared during the course of the 2 hours will be made available to all of you, and it will be placed on our website. We'll send everyone a link to that. So now I'd like to welcome Margie. Margie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Navina. That was excellent. And what an excellent intro from Zalina. And it's going to set us on absolutely the right path for this morning. Welcome, everyone. It is great to see everyone here this morning. And we have a Power Pack 2 hours lined up. So hopefully you will, as Navina said, remain interactive with us. There will be instances in between where we'll hope to get your input. And that will go a long way in terms of really customizing this session as well. So first, allow me to share my screen. Welcome to all of you, and thanks to CMM and the Center for Sustainable Corporations to bring us here today. And as Alina mentioned, if you find this useful and you'd like to share this with many more companies, this will be the first of a series of these webinars. So do come along with us for the ride for another webinar, or do bring along other companies as well. All right, so this morning for 2 hours, there are a couple of things that we were thinking that would be really, really relevant to all of you. And this is regardless of where you are on your sustainability journey at this point in time. Right after the introductions, one of the first things that we want to cover is why sustainability is a must for businesses today. And we want to talk about 3 things that every company needs to know about sustainability. And that, in essence, is about the extent to which we will talk about the why and the what this morning. That will bring us about 30 to 40 minutes into our session. Now, as most of these sessions will go, you will find that we will start off relatively conceptual, and we will go into a little bit more detail and much more action-oriented in the second half. In the second half, we're going to cover 2 very action-oriented topics. So the first is 8 simple steps in adopting sustainability today. And even if you are already on your sustainability journey, then this ideally will also help you move along and progress to the next step. Right after that, Tobias, who was introduced a little bit earlier, will come in as our environmental expert this morning and talk us through step-by-step guidance on calculating your GHG emissions. And that will cover our how for this morning. Now, it's really interesting because back in the day when we could still gather in the same forum or in the same conference room, oftentimes before we start a webinar, we would ask the audience in terms of, would they like us to talk about the why and what, or would they like to talk us would they like us to talk more about the how? And oftentimes about 80% of the room would like us to focus very much on the how. So this morning we're going to try and spend a little bit more time on the how. Now, as mentioned by Navina, ideally this is a session that is interactive, that is really designed for you. So in between, if you have any questions at all, feel free to type it into the Q&A. And as you can see, there are 2 dedicated Q&A sessions where we will try and cover as many of the questions as we can. So right into the introductions. We are Thoughts in Gear, a sustainability consulting firm based here in KL. And we've had the privilege of working with many amazing companies on their sustainability journey. And I must say, just from that, and this might be relevant to all of you here today, is that everyone has their own unique sustainability journey. And everyone is at a stage and facing a challenge that is extremely unique. But at the same time, there are so many commonalities that can be shared in terms of peer learning and in terms of really being able to overcome these challenges. So hopefully if you are facing challenges and you are here today, so that's amazing, do reach out and try and join such webinars in order to be able to hear from a lot of other companies as well. My name is Margie Ong, and I'm really privileged to be talking to you today. I am supported by two amazing team members, Kavita and Angelina, and even though you won't hear from them today, they've been a big part of this presentation, as well as helping us today monitor the questions and helping us behind the scenes. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Tobias Mengelman, and he will join us for the final session and take us to the end of the session later today. All right, now back to you. Now, as mentioned, we want to make this session as much about you as possible because we want to make it as useful as possible. So there will be 4 instances throughout this morning where we will check in with you to make sure it's relevant. The first one will be where we will have you participate in the chat box, but the final 3 will be in terms of a poll question. So let's start off with the first one right now. So if you can, and this is extremely important because I do want you to be represented in this webinar. In the chat box, can you type in what industry you're currently from? So what industry are you from at the moment? And if you can, we'll just give a few seconds to have everyone kind of type in. And how we will use this information is as far as possible. I mean, the slides will obviously remain the slides, but as far as possible, as we quote examples, we'll try and use as many examples as possible from the industries that you're typing in at the moment. Excellent. So it's quite a range. We've got financial services. We've got the agri industry, oil palm and pulp and paper, which rightly came right after each other. We've got manufacturing, automotive, glove manufacturing, very, very relevant today. Financial institutions and a corporate group. Yes, so you will have groups or holding companies which have a variety of subsidiaries underneath, and professional services. Thank you very much. Construction, keep it coming. I'll keep talking, but you can continue to type your industry into the chat. And as I said, the team members are definitely paying attention to that at the moment. Excellent. So we'll try very hard to kind of customize this for you today. So let's jump right in because we don't have much time to cover a lot of material. So let's start off really with why sustainability is a must for businesses today. All right. So you might be asking yourself a couple of questions. In fact, there are 3 main questions we're going to highlight here in this section. So your first question might be, what's the fuss all about? So you would have heard about sustainability, hopefully about 5 years ago, but maybe more recently, a year ago, 6 months ago. And you're asking yourself, why did this come about? What's all the fuss about? So there are 3 main areas of focus of why this came about. And obviously I don't have enough time to dive into the details of each and every one. But first and foremost, there came an increased and an urgent realization that the planet cannot sustain current human activity. So there's been the body of scientific work here has been in the works for years, if not decades. But recently, it has definitely come mainstream, and it has definitely caught the attention of important bodies around the world that realize that if we continue the way we're continuing at the moment, the planet as it stands today cannot sustain our current activity, and there will be a catastrophe in the future. And I won't go into the details of the stats here, but very, very visually, what this represents is very simply what happens if we don't act, and what happens if we act moderately, and what happens if we act in a little bit more of an aggressive manner. Now, there are obviously much more aspirational targets of being below the 2-degree mark, or even below the 1.5 degree mark, which nobody thinks is not currently possibly realistic. But what this represents, more than the numbers itself, is really that the end marker here is 2,100. And even though that sounds like a long way away, it's really not that far away. So it is, my son will be 95 years old, and my grandchildren will probably be middle-aged at that time. So it's not that far away. And what's interesting is that Elon Musk has said, and I thought this was quite apt, is that we're running the most dangerous experiment in history right now, which is to see how much carbon dioxide the atmosphere can handle before there is an environmental catastrophe. So that's one of the reasons why the fuss came about. The second reason why the fuss came about is really about, there was an increased clarity. And of course, as we know, communications has just exponentially exploded where information is right at your fingertips. So there's been increased awareness and clarity on the inequity and suffering of humankind. In fact, unfortunately, due to the tragedy of COVID, that we've seen the first rise in 20 years of the projected number of people in extreme poverty around the world. And in fact, unfortunately, yesterday, our own Malaysian Department of Statistics has released the latest stats on poverty. And I was shocked. 580,000 households, which is about 20% of the current M40, the middle 40%, have actually fallen into the bottom 40%, which is really shocking. And absolute poverty numbers have also risen to 8.4%. So this is happening all around the world. Over 40 million people currently are in what is called modern slavery. Now, if this is the first time you're seeing the term modern slavery, and I know that when I first saw this term, it was quite shocking to me to see that being used in this day and age, and in the instance of corporations, right? So these are instances of forced labor globally. And especially in the industries that were typed in the chat box earlier, in terms of manufacturing, glove production, you would have seen this be a real business continuity risk. So strong actions have been taken by governments all over the world to ensure that companies that are suspected to be having any form of forced labor around the world, and there's a lot of definition around that, right? That they are not allowed to be imported into their countries. In fact, as we know from the press, there have been Malaysian companies that have been banned by the US Customs and Border Patrol in terms of importing to any part of the US at all. So that is a very real problem and a business risk that we need to pay attention to. So that's the second reason why there is the fuss that there is at the moment. The next reason is that there is an increased demand for ethical and transparent organizations. And this doesn't just mean the private sector. So this is across the board in terms of the private sector, the government sector, the nonprofit sector, etc. That there is an increased demand for the ethical and transparent running of such organizations. And in fact, when polled, 1 in 3 companies have been reported to be constrained by corruption around the world as well. So basically, these 3 key drivers are the key drivers of why we are here today, why there is this global recognition of the importance of sustainability, and why you might be getting a lot of demands from some of your stakeholders in terms of how your company is performing from a sustainability perspective. And here today, we're also here to kind of demystify some of that for you. So if you have any questions that are very specific to what you're going through at the moment, please do type it in the Q&A as well as we go along. And then when we have those slotted Q&A sessions, we will try and cover those questions. So in terms of the fuss around these 3 areas, you will see that it links very, very directly with a term that you're probably already very familiar with, which is E, S, and G. So the environmental concerns, the social concerns, and governance concerns as well. Right? Now, why now? So why now is very much that the world truly sat up and took notice. So besides the fact that all the scientific data shows that the urgency cannot be overstated at the moment, the world truly did decide that it was going to take action at this time. So there are many, many guidances and protocols and actions and world bodies that have been taking very, very keen action in these three areas. There are three that we'd like to highlight here today. So the first one you would know of are the UN SDGs. So the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the Global Goals. Now you're probably very familiar with the colorful graphic. Hopefully you're also very familiar with the goals themselves. So the UN SDGs are quite unique, and I find them quite inspiring because it's one of the few times that the entire world actually came about and agreed on any one North Star, right? So regardless of sector, and in fact, this started out very much more in the development sector, but is being made much more relevant to the corporate sector today. But the fact that the world has aligned itself behind the SDGs shows that we should be aligning our practices and operations around the SDGs as well. And as you would have seen, our Malaysian government is also currently tracking and reporting on the SDGs. And if you're interested, DOS has a lot of data on it that you can also explore. The second such important development was around Paris 2015. And you would have seen that in that conference, which was COP21 with COP26 coming up soon, countries did make an initial commitment that they would make increased and clearer declarations along the way to ensure that countries are on track for the goals that were agreed upon in the Paris conference. That has had very shaky progress to date, but hopefully we'll hear more in November with the next COP coming up. Now, the third key development that we wanted to highlight to you, and you might have heard of it before, you might not, is something that is much, much more appropriate and relevant for the corporate sector, which are the SBTs, or the science-based targets. Tobias will talk more about it later on, but in essence, the science-based targets are targets that companies all around the world, and exponentially growing number of companies, are currently committing to. And those net zero targets that they're committing to, and will definitely, as Alina mentioned a little bit earlier, filter down to affect every single company around the world, regardless of which country or which markets that you're servicing. At the moment, if you're servicing only the Malaysian market or only the Southeast Asian market, you might not yet have seen a lot of pressure coming from your customers, for example, or your potentially your investors, depending where they're from, but it is just a matter of time. So we do absolutely need to be prepared. So very much that was the first question that we wanted to cover. So what's the fuss all about? So that's essentially what the fuss is all about. Now, one thing that we agreed that all of us here really feel is that, to be honest, we like to come originally from a point of view of the need, and in terms of really a global context of why we're talking today, but the why truly might not resonate with all companies, and we don't expect it to, and it shouldn't. But oftentimes, as you get into the understanding, it might begin to resonate more and more, but the why might not resonate with all the companies. But to be very honest, you do not need to care. You don't need to care about this to know that it is going to affect you. It is coming your way. All right, the second question that you might be asking is, okay, now that I know what the fuss is all about, who's actually looking out for it? So there are quite a few parties who are looking out for it, and we'll cover them very quickly one by one. And in fact, the governments, investors, companies, financial institutions, talent, and consumers are among the folks that are currently looking out for it, as we say. So in terms of governments, We mentioned the US Customs and Border Patrol earlier in terms of absolute bans for specific companies that are not complying. That was from a labor practices perspective. Obviously, there are many, many more emissions regulations as well. And in fact, in terms of regulations, the number of national net zero pledges and the share of CO2 emissions covered has increased even over the last 5 to 6 years. And as you can see, in the last 2 years, it has increased tremendously in terms of the number of countries that have pledged that they will either write it into law, that they have a proposed bill, or that it is currently in policy documents being explored at the moment, and that it might be placed into law in the near future. And that, and then the line just shows the global CO2 that's covered in terms of the number of countries that have pledged. The latest development in terms of something that you should look out for, especially if at the moment Europe is one of your markets. We've heard a lot about carbon tax, and in July recently, the EU has proposed the world's first carbon border tax for some selected imports, and this will kick in at the beginning of 2026. So we have from now to the end of 2025, which is just slightly more than 3 years down the road, to actually reduce carbon emissions or pay a tax as they're being imported into the EU. So there has been a significant acceleration in net zero emission pledges announced by governments, with an increasing number that is actually beginning to be enshrined in law. The next folks who are looking for it, which might be one that you might have encountered, are investors. And in fact, as we talk to many, many companies, we get a lot of questions in terms of, oftentimes it might not even be a conversation. It might just be a template that the investor has sent out to all their portfolio companies in terms of, can you fill in these data points? And that might be the first way you actually hear about some of the requirements on your company. And part of that reason is because, as Bloomberg has found, ESG assets are on track to hit more than 1/3 of global AUM by 2025. And Asia, though we're still very much at the beginning of our sustainable investing journey, we are growing much, much faster. So by contrast, Europe, which now accounts for over 80% of global ESG AUM, has experienced an entire decade of growth. So even though we're starting from a smaller base, we're now seeing much faster growth than in Europe, or even US for that matter. Total ESG assets in the region has been increasing, and I didn't put the graph in here, but then it's definitely been increasing at a very fast speed. Now, one of the reasons that investors are paying attention to it is also this, this principle by the United Nations. So UNPRI they have a set of commitments that are required from organizations that are actually signatories of UNPRI. And there are many foreign funds that are currently in play in Malaysia that are already UNPRI signatories. So if your investor is one of them, you probably would have heard of some of the requirements of you for your data on either your emissions or your labor practices, etc. Now, having said that, there are also an increasing number of local funds. In fact, when I checked, I think about 2 years ago, there were only 7 Malaysian signatories, and currently there are 12 Malaysian signatories to UNPRI. And among them, you will see big names like EPF, PUAP, and Khazanah. Now, they are also required to make reports into UNPRI. And so therefore, those reports can only be compiled from their portfolio companies. So if any of these are currently on your investor list, you probably have heard of their requirements already as well. who else is looking out for it? Now, companies. Now, earlier, Zalina mentioned the Standard Chartered report, which is critical because they have actually scanned the multinational companies, which might form a large part of your customer base. And 78% of this customer base of yours are planning to cut suppliers by 2025 for impacting their own carbon reduction goals, right? So, oftentimes, sometimes we talk to companies and they say, but these targets are not mine and I'm not ready or prepared to make commitments, which is absolutely fine. But these are commitments that have already been made by these large companies. And so now, as you'll find out later in our environmental section, when these MNCs start tracking their scope 3, you might be part of their scope 3. And if that is elevating their numbers, they have committed that, between now and then, there are also a lot of supplier programs. So they will work with their suppliers to reduce carbon emissions at the moment. So another note is if you have an MNC client, to approach them to see if they have a supplier support program, because some of it also includes funds as well. So there are programs in place for them to work with their suppliers, but if by then suppliers are not able to reduce their own carbon footprint, then they will be cut, unfortunately. And this is not far away, it's slightly more than 3 years to go. Now, at a more macro level, these are the markets that currently are most at risk. And I've just highlighted the 3 Southeast Asian countries that show up in the top countries with annual export revenue at risk. So in Malaysia, up to 65 billion USD is at risk at the moment. And if you make up one of those numbers in terms of export revenue, I would encourage you very much to pay attention to your own sustainability journey as well. So racing against the clock to hit their net zero carbon goals, MNC are increasing the pressure on their suppliers to become more sustainable in less than 3.5 years. All right, so who else is looking out for it? We mentioned financial institutions, and from the industry list just now, some of you are here as well. So this will resonate with you because you might be the one who actually needs to be on the requesting end. In fact, we've worked with quite a few financial institutions in Malaysia, and I'm very happy to say that at least 2 financial institutions at the moment have very active ESG screenings right up at the front of their screening process, even before any application goes through the rest of the journey as well. I did want to highlight, because we're still, if you remember, the first half were relatively conceptual and high level. We haven't gotten into the action part yet. So I do want to highlight the principles for responsible banking as well. So we had PRI just now, which was principles for responsible investment. There's a similar PRB, which many of you might have heard of. And there are also commitments that signatories have made within PRB. In fact, there have been 247 banks that have committed, and across 63 countries. In Malaysia, we have CIMB and Bank Pembangunan as the 2 banks who are currently signatories to UNPRB. All right, talent. So talent is also looking out for it. And I just heard this last week, actually, from a conversation where a hiring manager was telling me that, a lot of his candidates are actually quizzing him in terms of how the company is performing from an ESG perspective. So for me, that's very encouraging. So by 2025, millennials will account for approximately 75% of our overall workforce. 50% of this pool have been surveyed and have stated, in a survey, so we do need to take that with a pinch of salt, that they would consider quitting their current role and transitioning into one which was offered by a more environmentally responsible company. And finally, our consumers are definitely currently beginning to more and more look for ESG leaders in the market. and just, some very quick categories in terms of just showcasing that sustainability currently actually does sell in the market. And a sustainability leader in the world, Unilever, they have actually released the numbers to show that their purpose-based businesses at the moment are trending 70% in additional growth compared to their non-purpose-based businesses. All right. So essentially, that was the second question we wanted to answer, which was, okay, but who's actually looking out for it? So the third question and the final question for this first part of our morning together is very much about what's in it for me. So, we believe and we hope that you should have this question in mind in terms of, as I go down the sustainability journey, how do I make this work? How do I make this effort itself sustainable in and of itself, right? So what's in it for me? Now, there is a range, and this was highly discussed within the team as well. There is a range of actions that you can actually take. And that can range anywhere from being very conscious and mitigating a threat, or it can range all the way to really making it an opportunity in terms of something that serves your sustainability goals, but also is an opportunity for the business. Now, I am not here to tell you that it is not a trade-off. I'm not here to say that sustainability is purely a business positive. There will be investments that might need to be made, and those investments oftentimes will have returns, but those returns are also oftentimes more long-term than they are typically short-term. But there are also risks that you just have to mitigate as well. So there are three main categories of how we want to look at this at the moment. So the first area, more towards mitigating the threat, is really about reducing your risks. So we spoke about some of that this morning already, but really the risks around the ability for you to stay in business and the ability for you to be competitive. Increasing profits, so the ability to improve your margins and the ability to improve your market terms, ideally, and we'll break each of these three down in a minute. And the third area, which is the most exciting, and if it's always discoverable, but not every opportunity will be a win-win, but there are discoverable win-win opportunities where you actually find the ability for your company to differentiate based on sustainability and to innovate based on sustainability. Now, in the industry list earlier, we had things like palm oil, obviously a well-debated industry, as well as pulp and paper, for example, construction. So many areas where you potentially might have the ability to differentiate. Now, some of you, and I've seen one actually that have come from the renewable energy field. So hopefully that will give you the ability to innovate into a business that will become more in demand. All right, so taking those relatively quickly one by one. So reducing risks, the ability for you to stay in business and the ability to be competitive. Now, remember, if you have any questions, type it in the Q&A at the moment. After the first half of after this question, in fact, I will be taking some questions. So do type in your questions. So in terms of reducing risks, there are 5 key risks that you need to be aware of. So one is in terms of physical risks. So the most tangible risk to assets. This is where climate change will directly affect you, including those that may be submerged. We've heard a lot about the city of Jakarta, the country of Bangladesh, where there are huge expanses of land that are currently in danger. Assets that might be affected by extreme weather, including now with more severe storms, droughts, and wildfires. So have a look at your physical risks originally. As well, have a look at your existential risks. So assets in several sectors risk becoming stranded assets. Some maybe not in the immediate or near future, but eventually. So for example, extractors of fossil fuels, the producers of energy sourced from coal, oil, and dirty gas are obvious examples. But there could also be areas in aviation, for example, and construction if within that construction business, not more effort is taken, right? Transitional risks, very important. Business models absolutely will have to change. And this is a little bit where innovation comes in later on. But transport, for instance, must shift to zero emission vehicles. Emissions from offices, and we know there is now a differentiator in being able to rent out a green building, for example. So these are transitional risks where business models are beginning to transition towards this net zero goal. And very important is that even companies that avoid setting a target will be affected by decisions taken elsewhere. Regulatory risk, that's very self-explanatory. So if companies do not voluntarily work towards low carbon targets, regulation will force the issue, costly to those who are late to make the change. And reputational risk. So this could also very much be in the differentiator column as well, if done well. So for many businesses, transition may still seem a distant problem. This is dangerous, not only because of the high likelihood of carbon taxes. In fact, we've seen an example of where it's coming. Young people, the consumers of the future, are particularly engaged in this issue as well. Increase in profits, and largely the increase in profits comes from two main areas. So first is efficiency. So if you take nothing else away from this webinar, walk away knowing that the easiest way you're going to step into sustainability at this point in time, or rather, let me rephrase that, the easiest way you're going to convince your CEO or the board, or if you are a board member here today, that efficiencies will probably be one with a low barrier to entry. And that might be an area where you start to begin understanding what sustainability is all about. So eco-efficiencies largely generate more value through technology and process changes, whilst also reducing resource use and reducing your environmental impact as well. Some main aspects that you can investigate, including obviously reduction in energy, water, virgin material use, reduction of waste, a very, very big area of discussion oftentimes when we talk to companies, and pollution levels, extension of function and therefore product or service life, incorporation of life cycle principles, consideration of the recyclability of that product at the end of the product's life, and increase service intensity as well. The second area, which talks to the ability for you to have an advantage in terms of market terms, it has been proven that with your adoption and reporting of ESG, that you actually have a chance to lower your cost of capital, improve your operational performance, and potentially improve your share price performance as well. Last category for what's in it for me, which is unlocking growth opportunities. Two main areas. So first is really the ability to differentiate. So serving a B2B market, so oftentimes this morning we were talking with regards to MNCs, etc., that was more a B2B market, but really serving the B2B market in their need for eco-sensitive goods and services, but also serving a B2C demand for eco-sensitive goods and services. Building your brand value in justifiably associating your goods and services with environmental and social awareness. And it's been documented in that same report that MNCs are willing to spend more on net zero products and services. So ideally that will, I know for those of you, and I saw that earlier that there's, there are folks from the palm oil industry. I know that this might not traditionally have been the case, but more and more the procurement policies are very much changing towards the need and to actually spend more on net zero products. Innovate, which is the second lever in terms of unlocking your growth opportunities. So sustainable innovation, integrating sustainability principles right into your design, into your innovation process. can actually recognize economic value. And there are three clear, three main areas that we would recommend. So one is definitely in terms of purpose. So having a clear company purpose that guides your sustainable innovation process. So every time decisions are made from an innovative perspective, that innovation ideally has your ESG components in mind as well. Process. So introducing specific sustainability requirements and performance targets as part of your innovation planning process. And finally, and very importantly, building strong external networks and working collaboratively. In the market today, I cannot overstate the importance of partnerships outside of your company alone. All right, so that pretty much covers the first topic for the day, and I will try and speed it up a little bit, and I'll cover the next topic before we pause for questions, okay? So 3 things that every company needs to know about sustainability. So very quickly, we do want to customize this session for you as well. So I am going to run a poll. And this poll, I'll read through it with you, and this poll will ask you about the biggest obstacles that you're facing in your company today. All right, so let's read through it together, and I'll give you a few minutes or a few seconds to actually be able to respond to this. So the question is, what are some of your company's biggest obstacles in adopting sustainability today? Now note that this is a multiple choice question, so you can pick more than one if it's applicable to you. Thank you for those who have answered. So I can see the answers coming in. So first, we don't see the need to. Second, no board or senior management buy-in. Third, no clear ownership of sustainability in the company. Benefits and returns are not obvious. High cost or investment perceived required to start. Or we have the will, but we do not know the way. And sorry, there's one more. It flew off the screen for me. 2 more. Measurements indicators are confusing, or no obstacles currently. All right, so I'll give you about 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2. Oh, last few struggling in. Okay, 1. I'm going to end the poll now. And let me share the results so that we can all see where we stand. If you might need, okay, there we go. You might need to expand the window a little bit. So this is really, really interesting. And to be honest, I personally find it very encouraging because we've been running this exact same question poll for slightly over a year now. And I must say the responses have veered. There used to be a lot more in terms of board or senior management buy-in, but I'm happy to see that that has gone down. So the clear leader at the moment, high cost or investment perceived required to start. And measurements or indicators are confusing. That has traditionally always been high, right from a year ago. And then third, benefits returns are not obvious. And of course, we have the will, but we don't know the way. So, you know, I'd love to be able to address each of these individually, but I won't have the time to address them individually, but I'll just address the top one, which was high cost investment perceived required to start. I don't disagree. I think, you know, especially from a perception point of view, it does appear to be an area of investment. However, having said that, and taking note that this is an SME webinar at the moment, although I know that not all of you are SMEs at the moment, but but seeing that this is a high concern, I do want to state that there are ways that you can take steps towards being able to get on board with sustainability that would be, and you can actually rank your initiatives if you need to based on the investment required as well, the investment and returns, right? And there are projects that you can implement or initiatives that you can take part in or implement in your company that are relatively lower cost especially as I mentioned in the areas of efficiencies. That is definitely an area that will have returns that are maybe a little bit shorter term than some of the others. Business process improvement. This might not be a complete process transformation, but it could be very specific business processes that you could transform along the line that might not be as high cost as the others. Okay, so that I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to carry on with my material to ensure that we can finish up on time. All right, so thank you for participating. I truly, truly appreciate that because I think it helps all of us in this webinar if you participate in the interactive part so that we can customize it along the way. All right, 3 things that every company needs to know about sustainability. So walk out of here, hopefully knowing what is corporate sustainability, what are the current regulations, and what guidance is available, okay? So what is corporate sustainability? Very simply, now there are, if you Google this, there are tons of definitions out there, right? So we've gone with, for my sake more than yours, I've gone with the simplest, and we really like simplicity. So sustainability is truly meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. So remember right at the beginning when we spoke about my son and my grandchildren. So truly, it is really about them being able to have the planet that is habitable as opposed to the immediate needs of us, encompassing the ability to sustain and the capacity to endure. Now, a little bit more, slightly more technically, sustainability is largely defined into 4 broad categories: economic, environmental, social, and governance. You would hopefully all have heard these categories. What might not have been as clear is the way the acronyms are very lined up to these 4. So sustainability, 4 broad categories. And if I had to summarize this, obviously it would be EESG. Now you don't hear EESG in the market. What you do hear is you hear EES, for example, which encompasses economic, environmental, and social, which in summary is profit, planet, and people in layman terms, right? And also you will find the term EES being picked up if you are, for example, sensitive to Bursa developments, etc. This is a term that's very much used in the Bursa Sustainability Reporting Guide. It's also a term used in global standards as well. Largely, part of the reason is that the governance factor oftentimes is incorporated in the first E. So if you break down the first E under economic, for those that use the EES terminology, governance is oftentimes included in the first E, which is economic. The term that you might have heard of much more, and I've used quite a bit this morning, is also ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. Now, the reason it covers the final 3 categories and not the first, which is economic, is because oftentimes ESG is a terminology that's used in the investment world. And in the investment world, your financial disclosures are already very well reviewed, with due diligence, etc. Your financial disclosures are apparent and already well reviewed. And also published in a very standard manner where anyone picking up a P&L will know exactly what that states. ESG is attempting to set standards in non-financial disclosures. So very much everything that's outside of your economic or your financial disclosures, which is why they are called ESG or non-financial disclosures. There are efforts around the world to harmonize financial and non-financial disclosures into one. And so efforts include things like integrated reporting and efforts like TCFD, where very much you begin blurring that line between financial and non-financial disclosures because logically they do affect each other as well. Now, I'm going to whiz through this quickly from a timing perspective as well. But I thought this would be really, really interesting for all of you to know. And in fact, this is an interactive part that you can take part in without really answering a poll, but this is more on your own. I'll show you the 5 stages of a sustainability wave. And in your mind, if you can just visualize your own company and see where you are on the sustainability wave today, and also where you want to get to. That is already a very useful exercise for you and for your company. In fact, if you want to go back and have a conversation about it in the company, that in itself is already a very good visualization of how you want to move along the sustainability journey. So the 5 stages I'll talk about. So the first is pre-compliance. This is where companies feel no obligation beyond profits. It cuts corners and tries not to get caught if it breaks the law or uses exploitative practices that cheat the system. It ignores sustainability and actively fights against related regulations. Stage 2 is the stage of compliance. And many Malaysian companies sit there today. So the business manages its liabilities by obeying the law and all labor, environmental, health, and safety regulations. It reactively does what it legally has to do, and it does it well. Emergent environmental and philanthropic social actions are treated as costs, and projects are end-of-pipe retrofits, and CSR is given lip service. Stage 3 is going a little bit beyond compliance, where the company moves a little bit from defense to offense. You now realize that you can actually save expenses with proactive and incremental operational eco-efficiencies, cleaner processes, etc. You also seek to maximize shareholder value in the meantime, but however, your sustainability initiatives are still relatively marginalized, and usually it's marginalized within a specialized department as opposed to the entire company taking on the effort, and it's not institutionalized within the company. Stage 4 is where it's much more integrated into strategy. So the firm begins to transform itself. It rebrands itself publicly as a company committed to sustainability, and it integrates sustainability with key business strategies. Now, many companies around the world globally sit within stage 4. And in fact, very few, even global companies, actually move on to stage 5. So stage 5 are companies that are truly driven by purpose and passion. So driven by typically a passionate leader who has, and the company makes values-based commitments to improving the well-being of the company, society, and the environment. And the company helps build a better world because it is the right thing to do. And these are, mind you, highly profitable companies in the market today. So companies like Patagonia, Chobani, Unilever, etc. So not many companies that actually have moved on to stage 5. So if you could just begin that thought process within yourself and within the company in terms of where you are and also where you want to get to, because aspiration also is extremely important. So that's in a nutshell, your first, I guess, just what we want to say in terms of what you needed to know for sustainability. Some of you, I'm sure many of you in the audience are much way beyond that level of understanding, which is great. And we can definitely have that conversation in the Q&A, but we wanted to make sure that everyone walked away with at least that basic understanding. What are the current regulations? So there are 3 that I'll highlight, but there are a few more on the fringe that I'll mention. So one, this might not be relevant to you if you're an SME, but really about Bursa Malaysia's sustainability reporting guidelines, right? So the listing requirements that requires every company to actually be able to publish a sustainability report. Now, I won't go into what the compliance components are, but if you are being governed by this and you are interested, write to me after the fact. We do have a 40-point checklist to be able to guide you through that process, but I won't go through it here because I don't think it might be relevant to everyone here. Similarly, with FTSE for Good, suffice to say that you'd know that Bursa Malaysia has a sustainability reporting listing requirement. And if that's part of your journey in the future as well, that listing is part of your journey a decade down the road or so, that it's important to also keep that in mind. FTSE for Good, Bursa Malaysia. So this is a standard that was, or an evaluation that was introduced by Bursa back in 2014, where public listed companies are evaluated by FTSE for ESG purposes. One point to note for FTSE for Good is that this information is currently being made public. So if you are governed by that, you do want to pay attention to that. And of course, securities commissions themselves have introduced the SRI roadmap for the financial sector, and there are quite a few from the financial sector here today. And you would be very familiar with the roadmap, but above and beyond just impacting the financial sector, it will also impact, as financial sector impacts the larger community and all the other sectors, it would also truly impact all companies. Now, having said that, there are a few fringe regulations like MCCG, April 2021, that was released that requires, that has sustainability components within it. MACC, Section 17A, which it has also the anti-corruption elements within it as well. So just a few things to really, now here I'm just highlighting Malaysian regulations. Many of you are exposed to other markets as well. And if you are, I would highly, highly recommend that make it someone's job in the company to keep an eye on the regulations that are developing in those countries as well. All right, what guidance is available? Here, I will talk very quickly on this because again, it might not be relevant to all of you. So just so you know, when you start looking at global standards, that there are two key areas. One is the reporting framework and one is an evaluation framework. So reporting frameworks around the world like GRI, SASB, etc., they guide you on how and what to report. So earlier in the poll, you mentioned that measurements or indicators are confusing. I absolutely agree that if you haven't demystified indicators, it is definitely challenging. But one of the things that we really enjoy doing is peeling back the layers of these global standards and just showing you that they are really not intimidating. For example, you could pick up 5 indicators out of GRI and focus on that, and you are beginning to align yourself to a global standard. So give it a chance. But again, if you're not ready for that and you're not at that space right now, then start measuring internally with your own indicators first, but measure, definitely measure. Evaluation frameworks, as mentioned, FTSE for Good, for example, there are quite a few frameworks out there that are more focused on evaluation. So reporting frameworks show you and guide you how to report. Evaluation frameworks judge you, right? So they decide how good you're performing. They give you a ranking and oftentimes a rating and oftentimes a ranking in your industry as well in terms of how well you're doing. All right. I'm going to jump into some examples which might be of interest to you. One thing that I really like that Warren Buffett said is that he said, when people tell me they've learned from experience, I tell them the trick is to learn from other people's experience. And again, you know, if you don't pay attention to the specific examples, that's absolutely fine. Just know that there are a lot of people facing the same challenges as you are out there. So find out, talk to people, Google, whatever it may be, read annual reports, you know, just learn from the folks who have already done it so that you can avoid some of the mistakes that have been made. So very quick run through. This is, I had to pick, it was very, very hard to pick one, but then I had to pick one that I want to highlight. And then there are a few that I'll just run through in a minute. But the one I wanted to highlight is a carpet company that back in the 1990s was actually on the verge of bankruptcy. Actually early 2000s, the new CEO of Desso decided to adopt the cradle-to-cradle concept, making it one of the most successful carpet companies today. And they shifted from a linear economy to a circular economy, where the CEO was quoted to say that waste is food for new products. And here I'm going to run a very quick video so that we can appreciate what they have done within the company.
Millions of square meters of worn-out carpet are thrown away every year, often being dumped at landfill sites. Early 2008, Desso, a leading manufacturer of high-quality carpet tiles and broadloom, took revolutionary steps to ensure that carpets can be safely recycled. Inspired by nature's continuous cycle, Desso bears the true identity of the cradle-to-cradle philosophy. Desso offers clients a take-back program to ensure that products will be recycled according to the cradle-to-cradle principles. Products will be taken back by Desso after their useful life and will be safely recycled into new carpet products or used in other recycling initiatives. Besides its own products, Desso also encourages international collection of all types of used carpet, except for carpet containing PVC. These carpet products are recycled using Desso's innovative separation technique called Refinity. This makes it possible to separate the carpet fibers from the backing, producing two material streams which can each be recycled. The carpet fibers are returned to the yarn manufacturer for production of new yarn. For polyamide 6 yarn, this process takes place at Aquafil, one of Desso's yarn suppliers. Aquafil has developed a proprietary technology at its regeneration plant to turn recovered post-consumer polyamide 6 carpet fibers into polyamide 6 again and again. And today's bitumen backing is used in the road and roofing industry. Fractions from felt-backed tiles are currently being used as secondary fuel, for instance, in the cement industry. Cradle-to-cradle design is inspired by nature and sees carpet as being made up of nutrients that should consistently remain in use in an unending cycle.
So very quickly, the purpose of that example is really to showcase that, sustainability is business. Sustainability can be made part of the business process and ideally be beneficial to the business as well as bringing positive environmental and social impact. And very quickly here, I'm just going to run through, and I'm not going to talk about them in detail because I won't have the time to do that, but just 4 very quick case studies. So, these are not large companies. Yukos, for example, was a stationery and business supplies provider, and they started out being extremely skeptical, only to realize that it actually resulted in an increase in sales and profits by differentiating themselves early on as a sustainable supplier. And as we've heard earlier, the market is definitely going to start looking for sustainable suppliers, right? So, second example is Rainbow Freight Group, which is a small freight group out in the UK as well. So in the industry, which is highly under scrutiny for its level of carbon emissions, they started a multi-user night freight service. Now, it was originally started purely for commercial reasons as a very efficient way of transporting goods and services. But they found that it, in fact, because of their optimization of space, they found that it actually does bring quite a bit of environmental advantage, and also it brought, it appealed to some of their customers as well. Now, closer to shore, I'm just going to quote 2 very quick examples from Malaysian companies. So a company called WCT, who works on most of, a good number of the roads in Malaysia. They launched a green technology adoption program in collaboration with Monash. And what they wanted to explore, and they're successfully doing today, is really to use existing asphalt that they pull up from the old road as a sub-base material for the new road that is being laid, hence reducing the need to remove waste from the actual site, as well as reducing the amount of raw materials needed as well. The second very quick example is where MyNews made a small change with a big impact. So MyNews has initiated, and you will notice when you walk in the stores, a business process amendment across its retail chain for its cashiers to ask the customers if they need the credit card paper slip that usually comes to us. So they keep a copy and we get a copy before printing, resulting in an overall decrease in thermal paper use, increased procurement efficiency, and lowered costs. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight these very specific examples of simple business processes is because, back when we were talking about the high cost of investment, as I said, there will be large projects that will need substantial investments, but there are still very many business process improvements that you can definitely take along the way. So some very quick sample sustainability initiatives for small business: seek efficiencies for sure, buy or install green energy, use green office space, invest in business process improvement, focus on productivity and innovation, focus on developing human capital, and champion 1 or 2 sustainability causes out there. So that, in essence, covers the first half. I took a little bit more time than I was hoping to, but I think we're absolutely fine. We can still catch back on time. I'm going to take a few minutes to run through the questions here. And there's one in the chat and there are a few in the Q&A.
Margie, I think if you focus.
Yeah, sorry, Kaz, I was just gonna throw over to you because I don't have time to read through all the questions. Is there one or two particularly that you think I should be?
I think maybe let's just take the one from the top. How can SMEs assess the risk of stranded assets? If you could take that question, I think that's relevant.
Sure. So how can SMEs assess the risk of stranded assets for themselves, especially those SMEs that are part of the oil and gas Petronas supply chain? This is especially the case when the need for fossil fuels is still very much prevalent, absolutely true, as renewable energy is not yet a viable alternative to ensure energy security. So here, what I would, so there are quite a few risk assessment models. I won't go through them now at the moment. Unfortunately, I won't have time to do that. But very much in terms of being able to assess the physical risk or the existential risk for your own company. Suffice to say, if you're in oil and gas, it is, as you very well know, it is a matter of time. There will absolutely always, for the time being, be that demand for fossil fuel. And in fact, to quote one of the leading sustainability leaders in the world, he said if he has a button to press to actually stop the use of fossil fuels today, he absolutely won't, right? Because it will bring the world as we know it to a halt. And in fact, that's going to be the case possibly for the couple of decades to come. But in terms of being a stranded asset, I think the question is not so much in terms of if, but when. So if you're looking at a horizon of 20, 30 years down the road, I would very much encourage you to definitely pay attention to that now, because even though you're right, it is still extremely prevalent. As we heard this morning with all the different pressure points, it will, you'll be fast needing to account for it as well. Sorry, Kaz, is there another quick one that I can?
Yeah, I think this one would answer the first part. You mentioned about E, S, and G. Should SMEs focus on all three elements to become sustainable, or can the SME prioritize on one element of sustainability? Simply on a cost perspective, because it could be.
Excellent question. So, when we talk about ESG and the three elements, in fact, depending, I'm not sure which, for this question, I'm not sure which industry you come from. You absolutely should, in fact, be focusing on one of the, well, not one, but you should be paying more attention to one as opposed to some of the other pillars. So in fact, in the evaluation, so for example, our local FTSE for Good, for example, in the evaluation, different industries and different sectors have different levels of exposure. So if I take, for example, a financial services company versus an oil and gas company, your exposure from an environmental perspective, if I'm purely looking at footprint, so if for the financial services company, if I'm not looking at your portfolio companies and who you invest in, for example, your investment decisions, and I'm looking purely at your footprint, the footprint of a services company versus an oil and gas company would be very different from an environmental perspective. So possibly there are other steps that a services company or financial services company can do. So for example, as I mentioned, looking at your invested companies, but also from a social perspective as well. So your focus would be a little bit different. So absolutely, the answer is yes, do focus in on each of the elements. I will, unfortunately, I do see a lot of questions. What I will say is, I don't know if it's possible, but if CMM is able to summarize the questions later on, what we're happy to do is really answer the questions via email so that we don't take up all the time here because there's quite a bit of material still to get through. But thank you so much for your questions. So keep them coming and we will address them, but we might need to address them via email unless we have more time at the end of the session. So let's shoot for that, okay? All right. Oh, there's also in the chat an interesting question about Bursa Malaysia's sustainability reporting mandate, etc. So yes, we will address the questions ideally via email if that's possible later on. So I will now, unfortunately, have to move on and jump into the next half of our session. So I will very quickly talk through 8 simple steps in adopting sustainability. Now, in no way am I going to be able to give the justified time to this. And I do want to hand over to Tobias before 12 o'clock if possible, so that he can have enough time to talk about calculating your GHG emissions, which is extremely important to you. So 8 simple steps in the next, let's say 15 minutes, okay? Let's shoot for that. All right, now just before I do that, again, we want to customize this session for you, okay? So what I'd really like to ask you, and I'm going to launch the poll now. Oops, hold on, sorry. There we go. It's a relatively simple question, and it's multiple choice, so feel free to pick more than one. So the question is, what would you be most interested in hearing about in this coming section? So obviously this is the spoiler, which tells you what I'm going to cover. So first, how to get started in sustainability. Second, how to strategize and plan our sustainability efforts. Thirdly, how to measure and track our sustainability efforts. Or fourthly, how to report on our sustainability efforts. So I'll give you a few more seconds. Thank you for your participation. I see the answers coming in. And if you don't answer, unfortunately, I won't be able to focus on what you're most interested in. All right, 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and let's see what we're going to focus on. Okay, so more time on strategy and planning. Oh, that is so encouraging, by the way. I'm really, really encouraged by the participants because you're focused on strategy and planning. So first, focus on strategy and planning, measuring and tracking. Okay, how to get started and how to report in that order. Okay, so I will try and spend a little bit more time on strategy and planning and measuring and tracking. Will do. All right, so as promised, an 8-step sustainability adoption methodology. Some of you who might have joined me for a previous program or previous webinar, you are already well versed with this methodology and hopefully it's helping you along the way. But let's kind of talk through what that is. So 8 steps in 4 simple phases, okay? So the first phase is know. So very simply, to know about sustainability. And this is broken down into 2 steps. So one is awareness and the second is setup, right? So an awareness, not just within the people who are actually doing the work, but across the company, because as you would have realized from this morning, that sustainability actually cuts across your entire business as well. So definitely an understanding at all levels. Secondly is a setup. So in the setup, in terms of identifying baseline identification and your governance structure setup. So I'll break those down in the following slides, okay? I'll be talking about each of these phases in a bit more detail. The next phase is plan. So this is where you wanted me to focus on a little bit more in terms of really being able to conceive your strategy and putting actions in place. Third phase is do, which is around tracking and implementation. So very much the measurement of your initiatives, extremely important. And I'll tell you now that, you know, if you are not measuring and ultimately reporting on your efforts, you're not getting the credit that's due to you. So you could be doing the best things, but if the investor environment, if your customers are not aware of it, then you know, those efforts are great for the environment and for your company, but it's not helping you market-wise. So, and finally, the 4th phase is tell. So very much around the reporting and the storytelling, right? So we'd spoken a little bit earlier about how to incorporate sustainability almost as your personality or your image, if that is where you're headed, right? So very simply, 4 phases: know, plan, do, and tell. So let's break that down a little bit in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, so in the know, we want to, we talk about 2 main areas, which is awareness and setup. So in awareness, definitely seek a sufficient level of understanding for your board of directors, your top management team, and your sustainability working team. So they need a sufficient level of understanding of what it is that you're undertaking. Communicate at least a basic level of awareness and understanding across your organization. So they might not need to know, you know, the specifics of, you know, the 1.5 degree or the 2 degree that we spoke about this morning, although it'd be great if they did. But if you're looking to have very quick understanding, at least a basic level of awareness, if you need to, focus in on what your company is doing, because that makes it much more relevant to them, right? Feel free to use the material from this webinar if you need to in order to carry out those communication activities. Setup. So in terms of setup, there are two main things we want to encourage you to do. So first is very much around your sustainability governance structure. Now, this will be very different for a large company versus an SME. As an SME, you might not have necessary FTEs to really plug into, for example, a sustainability team that a large company might have, right? But at least take on the roles. So very much we would encourage a sustainability steering committee. Now, these boxes might not represent people, right? But it represents functions. So a steering committee who makes the decisions and who is able to steer the sustainability efforts. Typically, the board is involved and typically chaired by the CEO. Sustainability working group, this ideally is made up of a representative from every department across your company. So if I need to equate it, it would be something similar to, for example, your occupational health and safety or your HR. You have a representative within each and every department that acts almost like a champion for that particular. So a sustainability champion that forms a working group. And last but not least, very important, a project management office. So if at all possible, this might not, as I said, be an FTE. It might be 20% of a finance, of 2 finance people, for example. But really somebody who wakes up and keeps this machine rolling. It doesn't have to be the person most well-informed on sustainability or the one that's most strategic, but definitely someone who will keep the engine running, make sure the meetings are being called, influence the agenda on the meetings, make sure the initiatives are running, make sure the indicators are being tracked, et cetera, et cetera. Next activity that we would highly encourage is really conducting a baseline. So very much sending out a survey, for example, across your organization, because one of the questions that I didn't ask here because of time, but sometimes what we do during our sessions is we ask the companies if they think they're running a sustainability initiatives. Some people say no, many people say yes, but for those that don't think that you are yet running a sustainability initiative, I am pretty convinced that you are. And here, this baseline exercise is an activity to find out what you're doing across your company that would fall under the bucket of sustainability, even if it doesn't today. So things like, age-old concepts like lean manufacturing, for example, as a concept, or simple activities like turning off your lights at 6 o'clock. So little things like that, but also down to much larger initiatives that might be happening, efficiencies of ovens that are baking products, for example, being able to run higher rate of product for efficiencies, but very much also having an environmental impact. So find out what is happening across your organization so you know where your baseline is at. Planning and strategy, this is where you wanted me to spend a bit more time, so I will spend a few more minutes on this. So ideally, identify where you are and where you aspire to be. So I spoke about the sustainability wave earlier. You can always use that almost as a gauge of how far along you are, very conceptually, right, at a high level. Next, determine how fast you want to achieve your aspiration. So whether you want to be very aggressive and use a big bang approach in terms of planning your sustainability, or a more phased approach, or what we call an emergent approach. Use this information, use your baseline, and use your company, your existing company strategy, your company aspirations, targets, goals to come together and determine your sustainability strategy, your sustainability framework, roadmap, and targets. And oftentimes we're asked, where do we start? If we're looking to really begin to understand this and place a strategy without bringing in a consultant, how do we now begin to plot a strategy along what we want to do? So what I would encourage you to do is definitely start, and I'm going to talk in a few minutes about materiality. Start with materiality, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. Start with what matters most to you. Have a laundry list of areas where potentially you are currently impacting. Prioritize. align that with your company strategy and see the areas of most overlap and be able to then nail that down to a strategy, ideally over the next 5 to 10 years, and be able to break. That's very, by the way, being a living document that pivots according to how the company, the market pivots as well, and then place that into a roadmap with milestones and targets along the way. Determine your materiality matrix by running, ideally, a materiality assessment, a stakeholder assessment, and a stakeholder survey. Now, in terms of what this is, this matrix very, very simply just plots how important a material matter is to you versus how important it is to a stakeholder. And that's extremely important because some things that are important to you might not be as important to your stakeholders, and you want to find out what's most important to them. Now, taking a step back, the term material matter, and I've had a lot of people come up to me being very confused. It's sometimes just complicated words for a very simple concept. So material matter simply means important business issue, right? From an ESG perspective. So it's very much around, and in fact, from an EESG perspective, across the board for your company, what are the most important business issues? And that is what a material matter is. Exactly as it states. And ideally plan your strategic stakeholder engagement as well based on your stakeholder assessment. I'll spend a reasonable amount of time. I won't go through it in a lot of detail, but if you have questions, again, type it in the chat and we'll try and get to it either within the session or afterwards. So SDGs, I've spoken about the 17 goals. Just know that if you're beginning to align yourself to the SDGs, there are 169 targets that support these goals, and there are 232 indicators in there that actually support the target. So that could potentially be one source of looking for indicators. However, those indicators at the moment might be a lot more development centric as opposed to corporate indicators. What we would encourage you to look for is GRI. So I mentioned the Global Reporting Initiative earlier. These are those, we're picking out those that are relevant for the Malaysian market. Yeah. So GRI is a reporting framework that helps guide you on how to report and what to report. Within GRI, there are many indicators that are divided into topics. And here I've just included the topics, but if you dive into each of the topics, they have anywhere between 1 to 5 to 10 indicators each. And what that tells you, oftentimes, rather than looking at these reporting frameworks as frameworks that you have to comply to, I like to look at these frameworks as guidance. Like, for example, if you're, so I'll go down here, GRI 302 energy. If you're not sure how to report on energy, there's guidance in here in terms of indicators and even descriptions around the indicators of how you can actually track. So you don't need to look at global standards as something that you need to adhere to, but rather as a treasure trove of suggested indicators that you could be tracking if it is relevant to you. So have a look at it, I would encourage. And I won't go into detail with FTSE because I don't think many of you are being governed by FTSE, but if you are, type it in the chat and we'll address the question, or type it in the Q&A and we'll address the question later as well. All right. Now, finally, and right before I hand over to Tobias, reporting, I won't pay a whole lot of attention or time here because I'm not sure how many of you are being governed by Bursa Malaysia's sustainability reporting guidelines, but to the extent and the need and ability of your company, track and report on your sustainability. I would highly encourage it, even if you're not regulated today, track specific instances, whether it's just KPIs, and definitely report on your sustainability, even if the report is just internal at the moment. Try and get into that habit so that eventually, when you are required to report to your investor or your customer, it is already a process that you're undertaking. If not full-scale sustainability reporting, early approaches can be include ESG considerations in your decision-making, kick off a few isolated sustainability initiatives and document the case studies around those isolated sustainability initiatives, and maybe pick a few disclosures to track your sustainability. So for example, your list of material matters, your list of key stakeholders, your governance structure. And if you're looking for indicators, maybe indicators around your GHG scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is just a matter of time before you're being requested for it, and labor practices as well. The only thing I've put in brackets here, not to be confusing, but it's just to suggest that these are the areas within GRI that you could be looking at if you were interested in those topics as well. Now, the second component, reporting of telling, which is storytelling, we oftentimes encourage a company that once you are comfortable with sustainability, you've actually adopted and undertaken sustainability, being very careful about the guidelines of greenwashing, try and make sustainability your brand story. So very simple guidance. So keep it simple, keep that brand story simple, communicate your purpose. Your consumers and your customers now really relate to purpose. So communicate your purpose. And oftentimes as a company, you're there to fulfill a need in society. So tell them what that is. Let your personality shine through, connect with your customers, and ideally get other people to tell your story. And oftentimes that is something related to the environment or society as well. And with that, right on the dot, I will take some time to scan through your questions as Tobias is presenting, but I'd like to invite and introduce you to Mr. Tobias Mangelman, who is an environmental expert, and we're very fortunate that he's here with us today to guide us through very specifically on GHG. Over to you, Toby.
Okay, thank you very much, Margie. I hope you can all hear and see me well. So as Margie said, we'll talk about a bit of a step-by-step guidance on calculating your greenhouse gas emissions. And I won't bore you with a lot of details about myself. Just you can imagine I'm not Malaysian. I'm originally German, but I have been living in Malaysia for 18 years. So for all practical purposes, I'm half Malaysian. And I think I've been in the sustainability space in Malaysia for the last 12 years or so. But before we start, similar to what Margie did, I would like to quickly take stock just to get a feeling how experienced you are, because from the questions that you posed, somebody were already asking very specific questions about scope 3, scope 1, etc. Some were more general. If we could quickly trigger this poll, just to see, do you consider yourself a beginner? You don't fully understand yet why and how your company should calculate the greenhouse gas emissions. Are you quite advanced, that you understand the global needs? Are you proficient? You know what scope 1, 2, 3 emissions are, but you need to start doing now, or are you already an expert in this field? Sorry, who's triggering the there it comes. So please just take a second. You can only click one single choice. Are you a beginner, advanced, proficient, or expert? So while we wait for the results, maybe I'll give you a quick outline what we'll be talking about. We'll talk about two things. On the one hand, we'll need to explain a few very important concepts about greenhouse gas accounting, greenhouse gas emission accounting, things like what you already see in the questions, like scope 1, 2, 3, what is in scope, what is outside, what is in my boundary, etc. We'll quickly talk about that one, but then we'll go to a very tangible 6-step process. How can you very easily start today, this afternoon, to take stock of your greenhouse gas emissions? And we have the results. I guess you can see it all. So 1/3 beginners, 1/3 advanced, 20% proficient, 26% experts. So I will try to cover all the basics then as much as possible. If there are questions, please feel free, as for Margie, put them in the Q&A, and we will try to come back to them at the end, or we'll come back via email. But then, since there are a lot of people that consider themselves beginners, let's start with a few very important basic concepts, and you will see this infographic over and over again by many people. So firstly, I mean, when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, it's not just one gas. The most common gas is CO2, carbon dioxide, which most of you, all of you, will generate in some shape or form. But there are a few other gases. Some of you might be concerned about methane or nitrous oxide. We even blurred them out, because for all practical purposes, very few of you need to worry about the other gases. CO2 and methane will be the most important gases for you. And all the other gases, some of them are more powerful than CO2. So we call that global warming potential. You might see this abbreviation GWP. And a ton of methane is 25 times as damaging as a ton of CO2. So we typically translate that into a CO2 equivalent. Just be aware of this wording. You probably, if you use a simple tool to do the math for you, you will not have to worry about it anymore. But just be aware, if it sometimes says CO2e, it means your methane emissions have been translated into a CO2 equivalent. And the other gases, they are really more relevant if you have a cooling supply chain, if you have gases that leak from a cooling supply chain. Now, you need to report on these greenhouse gas emissions. And before you start even reporting, you need to understand that there are three different kinds of emissions. On the one hand, you buy emissions by buying products upstream. Then you have your own company where you produce something, you do something, you burn something, you manufacture something, and then you sell this product or the service to a market. And the definition of these three scopes is the following. Scope 1 is the direct emission that you cause in your company by combusting materials, either in a stationary, in a boiler or a car. And don't worry about the fine print. We'll cover each of these scopes in more detail. So, but most of scope 1, direct emissions from the activities in your plant, in your site, in your factory. Scope 2 emissions, the first set of indirect emissions, are emissions that you buy in by buying electricity or steam or cold air. So it's the emissions that you incorporate into your products by buying electricity from Tenaga, etc. And that is still quite easy, right? Scope 1 and 2 is still quite easy. Scope 3 becomes more tricky because scope 3 means, well, any kind of product that I buy, right? Being it a ton of steel or being it a piece of paper comes with a certain carbon emission footprint. So any product that I buy in order to produce my products and services, and also if I sell my product then to the market, there might be transport emissions involved, etc. Both of those are scope 3. One is upstream, one is downstream. And don't worry, we'll cover all of them a little bit more in detail, but you need to carry away greenhouse gas emissions. It's not only CO2, there are many. We translate it into CO2 equivalent, and you need to think about all three scopes of emissions. So now scope 1, we already started mentioning. It's actually very easy. It's emissions from generating electricity, heat, or cold air by yourself. If you are a palm oil company, you have, or if you are a palm oil mill, you have a boiler, and you might be firing mesocarb fiber or EFB or palm oil kernel shell or whatever it is. Or if you're a furniture company or plywood company, you will fire wood residues. But some of you might also have a boiler where you fire fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, heavy fuel oil. So this needs to be accounted for, the fuels that you combust directly in your own plants, being it boilers, being it combined heat or power plants, etc. Also, some of you said you were in the chemical processing. So if you're in the chemical processing or in the cement industry, in addition to the fuel that you use, your process itself produces emissions. Like if you produce cement, it produces an additional amount of CO2 simply from the chemical reaction. So if you have these kind of process emissions, you need to account them as well in scope 1. And then if you transport materials in and around your operating site yourself, this is also part of scope 1. And lastly, as I said, for some of you, there will be emissions, especially from refrigeration, fugitive emissions, that also need to be accounted for, because especially the gases that are used in refrigeration have a very high global warming potential. That is scope 1. Scope 2, as I said, is basically the emissions that you buy from Tenaga, Sarawak Energy, or Sabah Electricity, SVSB in Sabah. In Malaysia, it's fairly simple. We only have 3 utility providers. So depending on where you are in Malaysia, you will basically need to apply the emissions profile of one of these 3 companies. Very few of you might be also buying steam or cool air from a third party. There might be a cooling plant that is a cooling plant that you buy cold air from, or you might be buying steam from somebody, but it's probably rare for most of you. For all practical purposes, I think for scope 1, most of you have to focus on the electricity that you buy. And the third one, the scope 3, that is really where the first questions came, and also where the pain comes in, because that is a bit more complex. Because if you purchase goods, right, it depends very much on what kind of company you are. If you produce cookies, yesterday we had a cookie manufacturer, then I mean the goods that you buy is flour, sugar, oil, etc. Right? If you are a packaging manufacturer, then maybe the goods that you buy might be plastic resin, aluminum tin. But each of these products come with their own carbon footprint, which you could only find out from your supplier who sells this product to you or with a default factor. Then there are also capital goods, right? If I'm a construction company and I use a tractor or an excavator or crane, this heavy equipment also comes with its own carbon footprint that would need to be accounted for. Similar for any upstream transport, waste generated in a business, etc. And for some people, for service companies, more business travel and employee commuting. And then you have your product and you sell it downstream. And especially if I sell now household goods, fridges, air conditioning, they still need to be transported to the customer somehow. There's still a supply chain of bringing that good to a customer. And if it's even a cooled product, if you produce ice cream, right, the supply chain is even more carbon intensive because you need to transport this product cooled to the customer, and it even needs to sit in a fridge there for a while. So those are additional emissions that would count for scope 3. And often the most difficult part to get your head around is that there are also emissions from the use of a sold product. Meaning, if I produce air conditioning units or a fridge, the emission that the customer causes by using the fridge and buying electricity from Tenaga, this is also part of the scope 3 emissions. So I guess you get a feeling for already why this scope 3 is the biggest challenge for most of you, or for not only for most of you, for anybody in the world to quantify. Having said that, many of you are not obliged to report any greenhouse gas emissions yet. So getting your head around the scope 1 and 2 emissions is relatively easy, and we'll show you how. And getting an intuitive feel for the scope 3 emissions is very important. It's your first step. As long as you don't need to report, I'm not strictly adhering to what some of the reporting protocols will say. I will sometimes recommend more practical, simple approaches to get you started, which give you 80% of the answer quickly. So as long as you don't need to, you're not obliged to report these numbers. So it's a very simple process that you can follow. It's a 6-step process, and you will hear me mention the same sources and the same source of information over and over. We always refer to 2 sources where you can find excellent information. One is a greenhouse gas protocol. You will see it often in the source, and you'll see some examples. The greenhouse gas protocol is a not-for-profit organization that publishes multiple helpful pieces of information. And Margie already mentioned the Science-Based Target Initiative that also publishes multiple helpful information. And we'll mention these names over and over again because you can use a lot of the information from there. And for each of these topics, if you would need backup information, if we can't answer your question, you'll find it there. Because the first topic is you need to define your emission boundaries, right? Because before you start measuring, you need to understand what do you measure, right? And you need to define where do I draw the boundary, right? Is it my factory? If I'm a SME, maybe with a joint venture and 2 other companies, do I need to include them? If I have a subcontractor, do I need to include them, etc. And ultimately, actually, you can have some options how to decide. You could say, I do it by equity share. I only own 51% of this joint venture, so I only include 51% of them. You could decide to do it by operational control, which is probably the most common one. If this is a joint venture, but ultimately you are the controlling party, then you say, oh, I decide to include it by operational control, and I include it entirely into my my operations. Or you could think about it by financial control, whether you have a financial control over that company, even though you might not fully own it. For all practical purposes, I think for all of you, looking at by operational control will very quickly give you the answer who to include or not. Should you include your subsidiaries, joint ventures that you have where you have operational control? Maybe for some of you, it might be contract farmers, right, where you have a significant operational control. So then you have to find what is the boundary. So what do we measure, or where do we draw the boundary? Then you will be happy to notice we discovered already what are then the different categories of emissions: scope 1, 2, and 3, right? The scope 1 direct, from combustion, stationary, or mobile in my plant. Scope 2, electricity or cool air that I buy. Scope 3, the emissions that I have for my upstream or downstream partners. So once we know our scope and what we want to, the three emissions, that the boundaries of the scope, we need to start collect data, right? And the activity data to understand how do we actually calculate the emissions. And for scope 1, it's fairly simple, right? This is a question of diligence, not a question of academic intelligence, right? It's a question of diligence and having good accounting data. Because for scope 1 emissions, if it comes to the materials that you burn in your plant, you will probably have some kind of fuel monitoring system that tells you how much natural gas or LPG or diesel or fuel oil do you burn in your boiler or in your combined heat and power plant. Even if you have your biomass boiler, you'll probably know how much material you boil there, you combust there. For activity data for mobile combustion, quite similar, right? If you have a fleet of vehicles, if you are a company, a transport company, and you have a fleet of vehicles, you monitor quite well, right? How much fuels do you consume? Either you monitor it by liters or kiloliters, or you monitor it by kilometer, by distance driven. But probably within your accounting system, you have this data somewhere. And the only part where it might be a little bit more tricky is the activity data for fugitive emissions, where tools like the tools from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that I quickly show afterwards come in very handy, because they provide you with default factors that you can immediately use. And for scope 2, similar, it's also a question of diligence, right? Ultimately, all you need to know is how many kilowatt hours or megawatt hours of electricity do you consume? Do you buy it from Tenaga, Sarawak Electricity, or Sarawak Energy, or Sabah Electricity? And if you buy cooled steam or as well, but steam or cold air. And of course, I make it sound simple. If you are a retailer and you have 250 outlets, then you need to add up 250 electricity bills. But de facto, you just need to add up what are all the kilowatt hours that your 250 retail outlets basically consume, and do they get it from one of the three power companies. So that one, I think, fairly simple. It's a question of diligence, a question of accounting accuracy, right? Scope 3 becomes a little bit more tricky, because scope 3, there is the first question, should I include it, right? Because there is this within SBTI, within the Science-Based Target Initiative, this rule of thumb. If your scope 3 emissions are less than 40% of the total, I might not have to include it. But how do I know if I haven't counted them, right? How do I know whether I'm above or below 40%? And again, we would encourage always look at the companies that are already reporting under SBTI, because they have done the math, right? Let's be happy that many of the European companies have already looked at it, or the Australians or the Japanese. Just find comparable companies, look how they account for it. Do they include scope 3, yes or no? If there is no sector guidance, look what they do, and what they do will give you an indication whether you need to include it as well. If you then decide to include scope 3 emissions, there's still the question, which ones do you include? And there was a question also earlier on, I tried to answer it already. So which ones do we then include, right? Because there are 15 types of sources of scope 3 emissions. We already mentioned some of the upstream ones and some of the downstream emissions. And strictly speaking, you should take, of course, a full stock. What are all your sources of emissions? But if you don't need to report them yet, if it's your first internal stock take, use your intuitive sense, right? Use your P&L, your cost structure, and you will immediately see where your emissions come from. Look at other examples from SBTI, use your P&L, because if you are a service provider and you have payroll costs, business travel, and employee commuting as your 3 cost items, then business travel, employee commuting, that is where your emissions are coming from. As a service provider, as a consulting company, accounting company, you don't burn anything, right? You don't buy steel, you buy a little bit of paper, right? So you know immediately we can probably focus on business travel and employee commuting. If you do a major renovation, maybe there might be capital goods at some point of time, but for all practical purposes, service companies, business travel, commuting. If you are a construction company, of course, it changes completely, right? If you're a construction or property developer, immediately you will know, well, steel, cement, other building materials, wood, timber, roof tiles, etc., will be your biggest cost items, right? And they will also be your biggest source of scope 3 emissions. So those are the ones that you need to look at. And as a construction company, you will also use significant capital goods, right? You will use excavator, you will use machinery, etc. and you might need to look into waste generated in your operations. And the only really tricky one, or not the only, but probably the most tricky one, is the use of the sold product, right? Do I build an energy efficient house, right? Do I build a house that can actually be energy efficient? Do I build a house that can have solar heating and photovoltaic or not? So in the long term, you should even think about that, right? What is the impact that the usage of the house that I've built has because of the family that is living there in there for the next 40 years? Similar things apply to equipment manufacturer. If you're equipment manufacturer, if you produce a fridge, again, I will buy steel, I will buy aluminum, I will buy plastic resins, I will have a manufacturing line that produces it. I will probably have downstream emissions because I send my product to the market, I send it to a retailer, to a distributor. Again, there will be emission of using the product, the sold product, and there might be emissions of the end-of-life treatment. So this was just to give you a very quick intuitive sense of the financial holdings, because it's more about franchise investments, business travel, commuting. But this is just a very pragmatic way to start thinking about your scope 3 emissions. If you don't want to do the complete stock take now, right? If you don't want to count every single source of emission, start here. Look at comparable companies from SBTi and look at your profit and loss statement and ask your management. They will know where the cost and as a result emissions come from. So now you have collected the activity data for scope 1, 2, and you have decided on a few areas for scope 3. So now you still need to calculate it. And if you absolutely want, if you are mathematically inclined, you can do it manually, but you always say, okay, I have 1,000 liters of diesel and the emission factor is this, and I multiply it and I come to a result. But actually, we strongly recommend use existing tools. Just download the Excel tool of the greenhouse gas protocol, and in future there will probably be a more specific Malaysia specific tool. So MGTC is working on a greenhouse gas calculator, but for the time being, just use this tool, because all the activity data that you key in there, that is not this work is not in vain. Whether you use it here or in a different tool afterwards, it doesn't really matter. You can download it. We have put the link in there. It's a very simple Excel tool which allows you to put in most of the scope 1 emissions, all of the scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and only for scope 3 it is not able to help you with everything because they don't know what is the CO2 intensity of a ton of cement in Malaysia. But just as an example, for scope 1, right? If you have a fleet of vehicles, right, then you need to know for the activity data, as we said, you need to understand what kind of vehicle is it, what is the fuel I consume, or the kilometers I drive, right? And the Excel tool doesn't look exactly like that. I've cut it a little bit together that it's readable, right? But you literally, for your own purpose, you might just say, put in the license plate number that you know which car you're talking about. You put the year. You need to decide, do I measure it by fuel use, by distance traveled? Is it a diesel vehicle? Is it gasoline? Is it a truck, light duty, heavy duty, or passenger car? And if you put this information in, then the tool will pull for you the emission factors. You don't have to worry about whether the truck is now 3.5 or 3.7 ton in BDM. Just put diesel light truck, and the tool will pull an emission factor that is pretty precise. Then you say, okay, if I measure by fuel use, it's probably in liter or kiloliter. You can choose. I mean, there are nice fields to drop down, nice drop-down menus. If it's kilometers or miles, you can choose that. Let's say we live in kilometers, or we think in kilometers, and you put in the amount, right? And out comes at the end the CO2e emissions, the CO2 equivalent emissions that these vehicles cause, because they also cause a little bit more than only CO2. And that's it. Of course, I understand if you have a fleet of 100 vehicles, you need to do this 100 times, right? Or at least by type of vehicles. If you have 20 diesel light trucks, you might want to summarize the 20. But ultimately, if you have done this, you have just completed the scope 1 mobile combustion. And you're done. For scope 2, unfortunately, for the time being, it's a little bit more tricky because in the tool, the default factors for Malaysia are not in. But as I said, for Malaysia, there are only 3 default factors, right? There's a default factor from Tenaga, who published what is the CO2 intensity. There is the default factor of Sarawak Electricity. Sorry, I didn't pull out the Sabah yet, but basically those are the default factors of CO2 intensity per megawatt hour of electricity. So you could key that into into the scope 2, purchase electricity. And if you then, in this Excel tool, it's very, very easy to navigate around. If you click on results, it will show you that is the result in terms of, I only keyed in 2 examples now, right? I keyed in the purchase electricity and I keyed in the mobile combustion, and it comes up with a result. And yes, it will not be plus minus 0.1% precise, but this is plus minus 5% precise, right? And the only complication is the pain that you might have at the moment. Only the gray fields allow you to calculate the emissions in the tool, meaning the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. If you have other fugitive or process emissions, like if you're a palm oil mill and you have palm oil mill effluent, which causes methane, then at the moment there is no default factor in here. You would need to do this calculation yourself, right? Because that's not included. Or many of the scope 3 emissions are not included. So there you still really need to get your head around where do you get the emissions from, because only business travel, employee commute, and upstream transportation are included in the in this tool. Meaning if I import goods by ship, by container, I can calculate it, but it wouldn't tell me what is the carbon footprint of the goods. So now I've used the greenhouse gas protocol tool. I have probably 80% of my answer from this tool. Still need to work on some 20% on the scope 3 emissions. And then you can start analyzing it, right? Because also your management would want to know what is it, not only what is the absolute emissions. At the moment, most of us don't have an understanding, is 1,000 tons a lot or little? Is it big? Is it small? So typically we encourage people to think about it in carbon intensity, put it into something that's comparable. Like for cement, everybody calculates what is the carbon intensity per ton of cementous product. And then I can compare, am I higher than YTL? Am I lower? Where am I, right? And you can do this, service companies do it by per capita. What is carbon emissions per capita, per person, per full-time equivalent? But try to make it comparable for yourself, that you know where are you. Of course, once you analyze it, can you also review what are the major scopes, the major sources? Because only if you know where the emissions come from, can you identify opportunities to reduce them. And there were a lot of questions about, oh, should we reduce them? Do we have to spend the money to reduce them? And of course, at the moment, very few of you are obliged to reduce emissions. You might be asked by your customers in the future what your emissions are and whether you have a plan to reduce them. But think about it now, because as Margie said, anything related to efficiency improvement, anything related to photovoltaic, solar photovoltaic systems, etc., all these investments have a positive return on investment. The payback period might be slightly lower, what your management is used to, but they have a positive return and they allow you to reduce emissions. And then if you want to go down that path, you can set yourself targets. Again, few of you will have to right now, but take some inspiration from these companies who have done it, because it gives you an idea where you need to be in the years to come. And then you might put it into nice reports, right? If you have to report to the outside world, of course, you make it nice and colorful, and you will break it down into the different components that are relevant for your product. You might, if you're a food and beverage company, you break it down by the different products, etc. But if you need it for internal purposes, have an Excel file, right? Have an Excel file that you can discuss with your management, where you see, oh damn, scope 3 is really the one topic we need to focus on. And for scope 3, there are really only like 2 areas that are relevant for us, right? It can be as simple as that. It doesn't need to be super complicated. It can literally end up with a little Excel file that has whatever, 10 lines or so to get you started and converting it to a carbon intensity by product. And that was the 6 steps. Actually, I just added 2 more slides while Marty was talking, because I saw a lot of questions. Please look at this SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative. If you need sector-specific guidance, there are some sectors that have it, not all. Somebody was asked for construction. There is no sector-specific guidance for construction. But if you look at companies that have set targets, if you look there are companies on construction materials, on property development, etc. Look at these examples. They give you a lot of insights. Look at the greenhouse gas protocol. There is specific guidance for scope 2, scope 3 for specific sectors, and there is this emission calculation tool. So as long as there's no Malaysia specific tool, use this. It's very intuitive. An accountant in your company will easily be able to deal with it. And now I took much longer than I should. I hope we still have a little bit of time for questions.
No, absolutely. That was extremely important, Tobias. All right, that brings us to the final Q&A session, which I think we're just about hitting the end. And I was screening through the questions. I think there are quite a few. So from one that I can summarize that has been asked a few times is definitely along the lines of an SME and how to prioritize from a sustainability perspective. So I think that covers about maybe 3 or 4 questions. And I feel you. I think that's the first thing. I completely understand that there are a lot of restrictions. You might not even have a person to put on researching sustainability or even understanding the types of indicators that you're being asked for. And what I would encourage you to do is do a scan of your company, do a scan of the market, and also where how your competitors are moving, especially the larger companies, and have that on a laundry list of items of things that you think you need to do. And then go ahead and run a cost benefit analysis for each of them in terms of prioritizing which ones to do first. You won't be able to accomplish all of them right from the beginning, but at least get started on 1 or 2 initiatives where the cost benefit ratio is quite agreeable to your scan. So that's the one question I kind of wanted to pick out. Tobias, did you want to pick out any of the others?
Actually, I was already starting to type now. Yeah, but I didn't see, you have covered the one common theme. I think otherwise, somebody asked Jared about what's the result of corporate restructuring. Yes, if you restructure, of course, your company and you remove significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions, you should basically retrospectively adjust your baseline. Say, okay, we make the numbers comparable, right? So what would have been my emissions in 2018 if I already had divested the company then, right? To make it comparable. Addition, yeah, I think scope 3 again came up, and I fully agree. Scope 3 is complex, and scope 3 will remain complex as long as not all of your suppliers are able to tell you what the emissions are. So this will remain painful for the next months and years to come. And it's also painful for developed countries, right? If you look at some of the complex food and beverage companies in Europe, they struggle a lot, right? How can Ferrero find out what is the carbon footprint of my cocoa supplier in Ghana or Ivory Coast? But still they need to do it, right? And they will start with default factors. They will start, okay, if I don't know any better, start with the default factor. What is then the emissions per ton of product? And as I get better information, I refine it, right? So I think to Serena's question, it's more about, let's rather get started with the famous 2080 rule, put 20% of the effort to get an answer that is 80% correct, right? And then pick your battles where you refine those numbers. I think those were the only 2 questions that I picked up now on.
Absolutely. Excellent. And with that, we thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to Navina.
Thank you so much, Margie and Tobias, for that excellent workshop. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our session. As I mentioned, you will see a feedback form pop up as you click the leave button. Please do fill that out. As Margie mentioned, this is the first of a series of workshops that we're running on sustainability practices for SMEs. So if you are interested to attend again, or to get your colleagues and connections to attend, please, we'll be sending out another email, and we will also be posting it on our LinkedIn page. So feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. That brings us to the end. Thanks very much and have a great day. Bye.